I wrote this one paper called Democratizing Risk, where we were sort of, myself and a co-author, Luke Kemp, were analyzing the way that global risk studies are currently looking methodologically even at the problem of global risk. And I think they're missing a bunch of things by just pocketing things into a climate change risk or biological risk, right? Rather than looking at it from more sort of mundane literature that is looking at hazards, vulnerabilities, exposures. They're breaking it down in different ways. And one of the things that you notice quite quickly is that a bunch of types of risks sort of fall through the cracks if you just allocate them according to an expected value or these pockets of themes. And one of them are the sort of latent, potentially epistemic risks, right? So that is essentially the way that we're making decisions together, not being up to the task of the types of decisions and the type of expertise that is needed for that decision.
To rebuild the movement after the fall of Sam Bankman-Fried, effective altruists need to embrace a humbler, more decentralized approach, at least according to CARLA CREMER. CARLA is a doctoral student at the University of Oxford in the Department of Psychology, with funding from the Future of Humanity Institute. She studied at ETH Zurich and LMU in Munich, and was a winter scholar at the Centre of the Governance of AI, also an affiliated researcher at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and a research scholar at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, and also a visitor to the Leverhulme Centre of the Future of Intelligence in Cambridge. Now, CARLA has just published an article in Vox titled "How Effective Altruists Ignored Risk." I'm going to read out the introduction now. I'm quoting. Little did CARLA know at the time that Sam Bankman-Fried, a prodigy and major funder of the effective altruist community, who claimed he wanted to donate billions of dollars a year, was engaged in making extraordinarily risky trading bets on behalf of others with an astonishing and potentially criminal lack of corporate controls. It seems that effective altruists who, well, at least according to ChatGPT, aim to do the most good possible based on a careful analysis of the evidence, are also comfortable with a kind of recklessness and willful blindness that made CARLA's pompous claims seem even more fitting than she had wished them to be. By that autumn, investigations revealed that Bankman-Fried's company assets, his trustworthiness, and his skills had all been wildly overestimated, as his trading firms filed for bankruptcy and he was arrested on criminal charges. His empire, now alleged to have been built on money laundering and securities fraud, had allowed him to become one of the top players in the philanthropic and political donations arena. The disappearance of his funds and his fall from grace leaves behind a gaping hole in the budget and brand of effective altruism. CARLA said that people joked online that her warnings had aged like a fine wine, and her tweets about effective altruism were akin to visions of a 16th century saint. Less flattering comments, she said, pointed out that her assessment was not specific enough to be passed as divine prophecy, and she agreed. But anyone watching effective altruism becoming corporatized over the last years, the Washington Post fittingly called it Altruism Inc., CARLA said in her article, they would have noticed them becoming more increasingly insular, confident, and ignorant. CARLA said that anyone would expect doom to lurk in the shadows when institutions turn stale. CARLA went on. She said that in Halloween this past year, she was hanging out with a few of her effective altruist friends. Half in jest, someone declared that the best effective altruism Halloween costume would clearly be a crypto crash, and everyone laughed wholeheartedly. Most of them didn't know what they were dealing with or what was coming. Now, CARLA calls this epistemic risk, the risk that stems from ignorance and obliviousness, the catastrophe that could have been avoided, the damage that could have been abated by simply knowing more. Epistemic risks, CARLA said, contribute ubiquitously to our lives. We risk missing the bus if we don't know the time. We risk infecting Granny if we don't know we're carrying a virus. CARLA said that epistemic risk is why we fight coordinated disinformation campaigns and is the reason countries spy on each other. She went on, still, is it a bit ironic for effective altruists to have chosen ignorance over due diligence? Here are the people who, smugly at times, CARLA said, advocated for precaution and preparedness, who made it their obsession to think about tail risks, and who doggedly tried to predict the future with mathematical precision. And yet, here they were, sharing a bed with a gambler against whom it was apparently easy to find allegations of shady conduct. The affiliation was a gamble that ended up putting their beloved brand and philosophy at the risk of extinction itself. CARLA went on. She said, how, exactly, did well-intentioned, studious young people once more set out to fix the world only to come back with dirty hands? Now, unlike others, CARLA doesn't believe that long-termism, which is the EA label for caring about the future, which, by the way, particularly drove Bankman-Fried's donations, or a too vigorous attachment to utilitarianism, is the root of their miscalculations. A post-mortem of the marriage between crypto and EA holds much more generalizable lessons. Now, for one, the approach of doing good by relying on individuals with good intentions, a key pillar of effective altruism, appears, in CARLA's eyes, to be ever more flawed. The collapse of FTX is a vindication of the view that institutions, not individuals, must shoulder the job of keeping excessive risk-taking at bay, according to CARLA. She closed the introduction by saying institutional designs must shepherd safe collective risk-taking and help navigate decision-making under uncertainty. So to finish off summarising CARLA's article on effective altruism, first of all, I should clarify these are CARLA's words, not mine. I don't really have any skin in the game of effective altruism. If anything, my intuition tells me to be skeptical of it. It seems to have an air of elitism and grandiosity. It also has cult-like qualities that make me uneasy. Nevertheless, I think there are some very interesting topics to explore here in terms of governance, the effect of AI and other technologies, and of course the power of information in society. CARLA said, I'm quoting, "She's sympathetic to the type of greed that drives us beyond wanting to be good, to instead be certain that we are good. Most of us have it in us, she suspects. The uncertainty over being good is a heavy burden to carry, but a highly effective way to reduce the psychological dissonance of this uncertainty is to minimize your exposure to counter-evidence, which is another way of saying that you don't hang out with people that EAs call non-aligned, in air quotes. So she thinks that homogeneity is the price they pay to escape the discomfort of an uncertain moral landscape. The metrics used by effective altruists are imperfect at best, and small errors can quickly snowball into huge consequences. Furthermore, she said, the shift to long-termism recently in the community and expected value calculations have further muddled the impact of effective altruism, as the direction and goalposts of impact keep changing, while the speed of the progress remains the same. It's not the long-termism that should be blamed for effective altruism's failure, but the lack of effort to create an environment where mistakes can be made safely. CARLA said that we need institutions to take the lead in managing the uncertainty and not expect individuals to be perfect Bayesians. She said that for the next decade, effective altruists should take an institutional turn. She said that we need to determine the best mechanisms to assess and choose risk policies and figure out what procedures and technologies can aggregate biases and accurately incorporate uncertainty. She went on that the establishment of permanent citizen assemblies in Brussels and the use of machine learning to find policies that people can agree on are already underway. EA groups, however, have the opportunity to test these policies more rapidly. CARLA said that we need to research and find the procedures that best elicit experts, deliberate, predict, and vote. EA should be the lab to amass empirical evidence behind what truly works. CARLA concluded that in order to make EA members take responsibility for their decisions, Open Philanthropy should fund a new organisation to research on epistemic mechanism design. Despite the fears of bureaucratization, failures and wasted resources are inevitable. Epistemic collaboration is not a nice-to-have. According to CARLA CREMER, it's essential. This is a clip from Professor Luciano Floridi from Oxford University. I spoke with him last week, by the way. I published that episode. Similarly to CARLA, he thinks that the real problem here isn't superintelligence or even AI alignment per se. It's more of a classical problem of governance and having the right institutions, the right policies, having more friction between the legal landscape and the technology landscape. And it should not be left to individuals to make the right decisions.
You can devalue human skills. You can remove human responsibility. You can reduce human control, erode human self-determination. The rock who thought that their little drop of water was nothing, 18 years later has a big hole in it, because drop after drop after drop, the drop will shape the stone, will shape the rock. And I'm a bit worried that here, human nature, we philosophers, we know something about human nature, will kick in. We're lazy, we're also very malleable, and we are easily convinced to do this or that. So we need to be a little bit more careful exposing this very fragile, malleable entity to a very robust, quite silly, very efficient, very successful technology that will probably tend to inadvertently change the nature of that fragile entity. This is something that I would like to be a little bit more concerned about, not Terminator. The challenge, therefore, is how you govern all this, but governance is a matter of design. Designing the right policies so that the incentives and the disincentives are in the right place. There are no loopholes. People tend to do more the right thing than the bad thing. So all of a sudden we are shifting all this into socio-political issues. It's a matter of design. Design the kind of society we want. Remember, what's the human project here that we want to implement?
Also joining us this evening is IGOR KRAWCZUK. He is a researcher and PhD student at the Lions Laboratory at EPFL. His current research focuses on generative models and reinforcement learning for combinatorial domains, in particular, their application to integrated circuit design. On the humanities side, he's particularly interested in the interaction of specific algorithm systems and their biases with humans and society at large. In particular, he wants to contribute to the mechanisms of accountability that ensure benefits of AI systems are not monopolized or abused, and improve our understanding of governance structures in general. Somewhere in between is the subject of algorithmic mechanism design and game theoretical analysis of existing politio-economic systems. Now, I have had privileged access to a position paper that Igor is in the business of writing. He's, as far as I can tell, he's almost finished writing it, but it's called Why I Do Not Worry About AGI Risk. And he said that he's unhappy with the current state of the discussion about AGI risk that he encounters in the effective altruism community and its adjacent circles. On the first page of his paper, he gives an outline. He says that he thinks alignment is either a non-problem or identical with the principal agent, social choice, and good corporate governance problems in politics. He said that he doesn't agree that the risks posed by losing control of human level or beyond AGI are plausible, or indeed large enough to pose an existential risk. He goes on that AI risk is first and foremost a political problem. He doesn't think technical work on technical AI safety, which is to say interpretability, algorithmic fairness and robustness, etc., can help reduce AI risks without political pressures, which themselves are risky things due to regulatory capture. And finally, he says that he doesn't think that we are at all close to human-level AGI, and human-level AGI will, if at all, be achieved in incremental, individually well-understood steps.
There is no Terminator coming. There is no gods in the sky deciding for us. There is nobody but humanity responsibility for what we're going to do with this technology. And anyone who disagrees, I hope is just naive and doesn't have an agenda.
I had a conversation with Connor Leahy back in December. He is one of the co-founders of Elitha AI and the CEO of Conjecture. And he has some very interesting opinions on AGI and scale and alignment. This is Connor. So a lot of, by the way, you know, the rationalists in philosophy, so the different type of rationalists, like Thomas Nagel and Noam Chomsky. We spoke to Chomsky. He said that many things in the world are just beyond our cognitive horizon. He gives the example of the prime number maze, which rats can't solve because rats just don't have the cognitive ability to do that. No one understands economics, right? Yep. And Chomsky says that physicists are meter readers, and he cites physics as being almost like this very reductionist view of a much more complex reality. And we just kind of take observables and we create intelligible theories to understand the world that we live in. Yep. So isn't that cognitive horizon going to stop us from building interpretable AI?
If we, in one shot, build systems that are so far beyond our cognitive horizon, we can't understand them, and then we turn them on, we die. Obviously. Can we build systems that are 0.5 or 1.5 cognitive horizons, and we just develop much, much better theories to understand them? Now that's a more interesting question. And if we have a 1.5 system, can we use it to build a 2.5 system? And if we have a 2.5 system, can we use it to build a 5 system? And if we have a 5 system, can it understand a 10 system? I don't have an answer to this question, but it doesn't seem obviously impossible to me. It seems obviously probably impossible that if you just get 1000x AGI drops from the sky, you're screwed. You can't understand this thing. You will never understand this thing. We will never, ever understand this thing, and if we turn it on, that's it. And we're game over. But if we build a much more... That's why I'm focusing on this, like, we get to build the AI. This is a common conversation I have with people, where people are like, wow, Connor, why aren't you like happy about like scaling laws? It makes like our intelligence like predictable. And I'm like, no, it doesn't at all. We don't know how to predict how smart AIs are. This is a big problem why the alignment problem is hard. Is people sometimes will be like, oh, it's fine. We'll just wait until it's like just below danger and then we'll stop. And I'm like, first of all, lol, imagine corporations just stopping. B, how do you know you're just one step away from the bad thing before it's already too late? How would you know? And sometimes people like, hand wave something's on the scaling laws. I'm like, okay, at which loss does it become super intelligent? Like, please show me the number. Like, no, of course not. That's very silly. It's the ability to predict how powerful a system will be is dependent not only on the agent you're studying, but also on its environment. So you also have to have a very, very strong theory about the environment it's interacting with. And because the environment is the universe, and we don't have super strong predictive theories of the entire universe, we can't predict this kind of stuff. And this is at the core of why I think this is hard. I think if we could all agree to just like, slow the fuck down, let's just like go only like teeny micro steps until we've like developed as much theory as humanly possible, and then we take one more micro step, and then we develop as much theory as humanly possible, and then we take one more micro step. Yeah, I think we'd be fine. Probably. Maybe not. Maybe one of those micro steps still kills us, but it's like possible. But like currently, we're not even trying. Like currently, we're just like, let's just make as big a steps as possible, as often and as fast as possible, and just see what happens, lol.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in a way you're like a mystery to me, because you are very bullish and accept. I mean, you're worried about the future, but you're very accepting of the technology revolution that's going to happen over the next few years. And I guess like my skepticism is, having just done a show on Searle, for example. I know you don't agree with Searle, but he makes an argument that agency and intentionality are very important, and he actually thinks biology is required. But when I spoke to Pedro Domingos about this, he said, no, Tim, that's ridiculous. It's like, you have a grain of sand and it turns into a pearl, so you have the starting conditions. And I guess you might argue that AI becomes really dangerous when you have this reflexivity. So now it's going to the internet, it can compile code, it can run programs, it can interact, it can improve itself, and all the rest of it. So I guess like the question to you is, what do you think are the most dangerous steps? Or maybe you don't want to talk about this. You don't want to talk about this, yeah.
If I knew,
I can imagine. Yeah.
If I knew how to build a dangerous AGI, I would not tell you.
And presumably you do.
No comment.
This is a snippet of a conversation I had with Ethan Caballero at Nuix in December or so last year. I think it's interesting to compare Ethan's opinion. He is an AGI scaling maximalist, with Igor's opinion.
But do you think there's something like, because we're talking about scaling bottlenecks, is that an intrinsic thing in systems?
There's the notion of there's an exponential, and an exponential goes, it's an exponential forever until it hits the physical bottleneck, and then it turns into a sigmoid. So there's that notion of bottleneck. If you scale so far, and that you're even scaling further than the fastest future supercomputers, then you've hit the bottleneck of compute on the x-axis.
Okay, so what do you think the bottlenecks will be in the world that we live in?
We're talking kind of where you're kind of extrapolating timelines, epoch AI, Jaya-Kotra stuff.
Yeah.
Basically the current narrative is for the next 10 to 20. Okay, for text, it's basically compute's going to be the bottleneck until mid 2020s or mid 3030s.
Yeah.
For video, compute's going to be the bottleneck at least until the 2040s. But, and then at that point, it's going to switch to data being the bottleneck.
Okay.
And that's just for the capabilities part. For the alignment part, it gets more complicated, because they're your bottleneck by how fast can humans send their preference data to the machine to do RL from human feedback or whatever.
Yeah.
I agree that's not the fastest path to AGI, but if you're just saying oh, why should we believe it could be simple? The one that actually already happened was a cartoonish is simple at the right level of abstraction.
Well, but presumably you do think that it would also be possible to construct an AGI, using some kind of a higher level system, let's say a cognitive architecture. But why would we not want to do that?
Just it has worse scaling laws. Or it might have better scaling laws, but we'll have scaled to AGI doing the dumb thing before we have figured out the cognitive thing.
Anyway, folks, I really hope you enjoy the discussion this evening. Remember to subscribe and give us a rating on your podcast app. Enjoy.
One of the things that I find in that space is just that there's a lot of memes that are not particularly helpful in actually dealing with the real questions that we ought to be dealing with. So maybe it helps a little bit to think about what risk even is, right? It's sort of a set of probabilities over a set of outcomes that are not preferred for some reason. And then when you're thinking about trying to minimize risk, rarely you can think about trying to get it to zero. You're always thinking about shifting that distribution away from particular set of outcomes that you do not favor. And then you immediately are asking that question of, well, who gets to shift that risk away from what set of outcomes that are not preferred? By what kind of people, right? So there's immediately this question of a political dimension in influencing risk, because it is about controlling a set of outcomes. And as soon as you're taking that frame and you're putting that into the context of AI, you can ask the question of, well, how do you actually control a set of outcomes? Well, you can make have a better understanding of how to actually influence particular outcomes. So that is trying to gain a more fine-grained understanding of the particular procedures that lead to particular outcomes. You can get the possibility of having better predictions about how your actions influence certain outcomes. You can already see, right, a lot of algorithmic tools will be very, very useful in this. And a lot of control over outcomes will come from measuring, right, gaining access to data, so simply aggregating more information. Again, lots of AI tools are going to be useful there, and gaining more predictive control by it. And so this intersection, I think, of control and algorithmic procedures immediately pushes you into this question of the political dimension of risk and the political dimension of AI. And that is something that I think in alignment or in AI safety and generally in the global risk domain is not discussed very often. As soon as some people get to set the particular procedures by which outcomes are being controlled and probabilities are shifted, you are asking the question of who has the power to set those particular controls. And that tends to be a small set of people that may or may not have preferences over outcomes that are actually matched to the preferences of the people that are experiencing the outcomes of these events. And that leads me to ask the question of, is AI alignment or safety not just a few computer scientists suddenly discovering that actually there's a big literature in the humanities that have been dealing with this question of how do we align people in a multi-agent setting, right? Whether that is citizens with their government or people that are considered consumers with companies or citizens with each other in a setting where they disagree about what outcomes are favorable, which kinds of risks are worth taking and which ones are not worth taking. This is very much a question about values, right? And about politics. And that is, I think, a really big meme that hasn't really seeped through the debate, is that this is a very, very old question, an old set of questions that are now being rediscovered under a different type of language with different labels. And that is a little bit concerning in the sense that there is a huge literature that one can just look at. It's a huge set of experts in political theory and so on that obviously have a lot to say about these issues. But because we label it alignment or so on, it is considered a technical question and a question about how do we code the particular answers in an actual computer code.
Could I just have one comeback on that? So I'm interested to talk about or to define what kind of risk or what kind of quantity we're dealing with here. Heidegger spoke about the risk of technology itself, which is to say this intermediary between us and ontological reality and how it goes two ways. It deranges us. And people like Luciano Floridi have spoken about the dangers of information. And I guess what I'm saying is that one lens is quite a common one, which is that there's a pernicious kind of almost like a climate change of society. And then we can get into the discussion about governance and so on. But some folks talk about AI risk in terms of runaway intelligence, like something which is an immediate existential risk. So which of those two are you talking about?
So when you take this control version of AI risk or this control perspective, then I think the most likely outcome is not this AGI superintelligence type scenario, but what you can imagine is simply the kind of dynamics of control that we currently see in institutions on steroids. So what we're doing here is similar to what we see with normal laws. You're standardizing a set of preferences of a small set of people, usually, across a whole range of contexts that apparently could be treated with the same set of procedures, right? The same laws, the same algorithm. And there's an assumption made that this particular set of procedures that you specify once is applicable to all of those different contexts. And sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, right? But what it does is certainly to exert the control of the first specification of that procedure by that set of people onto the rest of people that are being, under that procedure being treated in that way. And so the most likely outcome here is a sort of calcification, I think, of the kind of institutions that we see and the problems that come with those institutions, right? So all of the governance failures that we see at the moment, you can sort of imagine, well, what would happen if all of those would be codified in computer code, right? The kind of procedures. So really, the kinds of risks that I usually talked about in the surveillance, right, or authoritarian regimes using these set of tools to their ends. These are the much more likely outcomes, I think, and certainly the ones that we should be more concerned about, these lock-in scenarios, than these AGI single runaway scenarios. But there's a lot to be said about this idea of the G in the AI, which I have a lot of problems with, and the general meme here. But yeah, that I think is the most likely outcome that we ought to focus on.
Wonderful. Igor, let's bring it over to you. So first of all, there's this wonderful term by Luciano Floridi, which he calls a singularitarian, which is, there's also the atheists, the spell AI-thiests. So there are two extreme views. So what's your position on that, and what levers can we pull?
What is the term singularitarian atheist in this context?
So singularitarians are people who think that the singularity is close, and there's going to be runaway superintelligence. And the atheists, spelled AI, are people who think that AI is completely useless and will never amount to anything. So that's a spectrum. Where do you exist on that spectrum?
So I like one take who was kind of published by Charles Stross, that the singularity happened in the 1970s when the internet went online and we're like already post-singularity. But like the original meaning of singularity was you can't predict things after this one. And then people kind of use this as their new like apocalypse where things will be revealed. And at this point, like history finally ends. And so like if you take this concept seriously and you don't just look at it in this historical context of people predicting the end of the world for thousands of years, basically, then one point where you could place that would be where we really went from being able to exchange large amounts of data, maybe in a city, to everywhere on the planet. And there's like one meaningful point to put that there. If you take maybe a more common version of answering this, is that I don't think there's ever gonna be like this radical change and this disruption, because if you look close enough at any disruption, you usually see like the small increments that like this was coming a long time ago. Everybody remembers the iPhone suddenly appearing, and then a couple of years later it was everywhere. But they didn't see like the 3 or 4 false starts or like it came before. They kind of led the way before it was finally ready. And in the same way, like I don't think AI will ever be like completely like it will be useless. Or I'm not saying that we might never have something that has like a human level of intelligence. I just think at that point it will be so well understood what that really means that we will not really look at it as like this momentous shift. This is going to be like this was obviously that was going to come. We all have adapted to this already, as we already keep doing, because the way we talk about AI is the same way we talked about software before, which is the same way we talked about industrialization. This goes through history whenever there's like a new technology coming, and so I'm probably closer to the atheist part, but not completely saying that it's worthless. Just that it would be a very boring like time when the AI actually arrives.
Could I push back on that a tiny bit? Because there is a digital divide now. There are thousands of exabytes of data. It's increasing exponentially. We have a digital footprint which is kind of diverging from our true selves, and our children will lead very different lives to us. They'll be so hopelessly enmeshed in technology, and don't you see that as quite a significant transient?
Not really, because like before the invention of a printing press, like books were something that you might own one, and you would have to pay like more money than you would need to feed a family for decades for. And now books are like a commodity. That is also like a momentous change that occurred. Like the amount of data that we work through now, like a lot of this data is just big because we have the capability to process it, and we have the sensors to process it. So like, it's not like we are drowning as a society in data, and that like it has completely changed our capability. It's just that we have a capability of processing data, so we go to the limit of this capability of processing data, and like this as we have built up over like centuries of development more and more capabilities of processing data, so have we built up the capability of collecting it, storing it, and working with it. And there is a new type of literacy that is required to actually engage in this. Like, it used to be that you were fine if you couldn't read, and then that became mandatory. And then it was fine to not really know anything about computers, and now that is mandatory. Like, if you want to participate and be like a fully kind of emancipated human in these societies. And in the same way, it's gonna probably be a requirement to enable people to own their own data, own their own, you call it like a digital footprint, and have like a type of sovereignty. And I think laws like the GDPR are like a response that is coming like just in time. But again, these are the same types of processes that have been happening in similar ways throughout the history, and we're acting as if it is a big momentous thing, because it's always nice to live at the end of history where like this is the final thing we need to solve, and then either utopia or disaster. But actually, usually like things are very boring, and we will like have lots of lawsuits and lots of regulation and lots of political debates, but like there's no magic. And if you go into this with this mindset of like, oh, this is different, you're kind of implicitly hyping up the technology. So like the companies selling the technology to deal with this data, they love that. Like, it's a really good marketing thing. But if you look at it like in a sober, not like cynical way, but not a like salesperson way, like, yes, it will change everything, just like the hundreds of times this has happened before.
Okay. So Carla, there was that film, The Social Dilemma, which spoke about the derangement of our attention, and we have the advent of Google and marketing and so on. And of course, I mean, even Chomsky in his Manufacturing Consent, he spoke about the deranging forces of markets. But I would argue that there is something different now when we have digital simulacra of ourselves in the world. We have things like privacy problems, appropriation problems, and so on. So. I mean, would you agree that it really is quite a change?
Yes. One thing we should take note of, and I fully agree with you here, is that this is a set of statistical tools that we package under one term, which we call AI, and that's an extremely good way to create a bunch of hype. A bunch of the risk is precisely coming from tools that are not quite ready for a particular context to be applied, because that context is too complicated, too complex, and the tool is just not able to capture all of that. But they are being applied by companies, by governments, because the promise of them, those tools actually, capturing the complexity of that particular context was hyped up under the term of AI, right? And a lot of people have made this comment that we ought to go back to talking about it as a set of statistical tools and take the magic out of it. In part also because I think you're completely right to raise all of these real issues of privacy, of the attention economy. But none of this is magic, and I think this is exactly what Igor is portraying really well here, is that if you take away this layer of this is an existential risk, that is this runaway technology that will run towards us, there's nothing we can do, then you, by default, disallow every citizen and every politically minded person who will have an opinion on what they consider to be their rights on privacy, how they want to deal with their attention, and how they want it to be affected, or how they want to vote. You will not allow them to be part of that conversation. And I think when you're considering the kind of narrative around AI alignment and safety, there's this weird combination of, on the one hand, saying the kind of world that we imagine to be good in the future is exactly the world that depends on an AGI-type singleton and the kind of technologies that we only get by solving intelligence. And at the same time, we are needing to build the thing that we're most scared of, right? That object that is creating this existential risk, which is already a strange way of thinking about risk. The only way why they can consider this to be the biggest thing, the biggest risk to work on, because there's a sort of neat agent like story to be told of how you get from the current world to one that is ruled by this overlord that kills everyone, takes control over everyone. Usually a very abstract and implausible story to tell. But it's the only way in which you can actually get to this concept of existential risk, where everyone dies from, one single event, which is actually not how risk happens usually in the world. It happens much more via the kind of thing that you mentioned right now, where you have these systemic interacting problems that are interfacing, very hard to disentangle, but they create particular scenarios in which then something blows up. Usually it doesn't blow up to the extent that everyone dies, right? But AI is the only way to tell that story, and then to say the expected value of working on that thing is the most important thing, turns out also to be the thing we need to create our utopia. And there's this strange dichotomy, and Igor mentioned this to me at one point, I think, that if you take them seriously for that belief, they wouldn't really be acting in this way as they do now. What they're doing now in AI alignment and so on is to very much run with the theory of we need to be at the forefront of that development in OpenAI and DeepMind and so on, in order to have a say about where this technology goes. If you really thought that technology would kill everyone and would be that existential, wouldn't you at least argue for a moratorium? Wouldn't you at least try and set up a campaign to inform citizens about how terrible this is and make them do an uprising? There's so many other ways of dealing with this issue, but I think this points towards a bit of an ideological, again, like a political motivation behind why we need to support these set of technologies.
Interesting. Igor, I mean, I think to a certain extent, this is a matter of gradient. And I agree with you, Carla, that maybe it's more abstract and analogous to climate change rather than something that's going to run away. But you could still argue, though, that technology in some sense is enslaving us. And none of us here are techno-Luddite. We like technology. But then if it is pernicious and abstract, then we get into consequentialism, essentially, because we're talking about possible trajectories into the future and various interventions. So what's your take?
Okay, so first I have to say that I need to state out, even if we don't have time to go into it in this podcast, is that the risk scenarios that lead to the technology running away are built on assumptions in assumptions. So there's so many assumptions in there that you basically leave any claim of doing forecasting, and you're just doing in my opinion, bad science fiction, and we can get to that if we have time. The next thing I want to say is that the Luddites get a bad rep, that they were not anti-technology. The Luddites were highly skilled artisans who felt that they were not meaningfully compensated and accounted for in the technological shift, and were basically organizing to have a voice in that transition. And then, as usually in history things, the people who had more power crushed the uprising. And there's now this meme we have of the Luddites being just anti-technology, which is not the same thing as saying, hey, we don't think it's a good thing that we worked very hard and we have all of these skills, and we have also helped you maybe perfect these looms, and now we're being completely marginalized by them with no accountants for us, and we are people, we have rights, and we assert these rights. So that is just for the Luddites. And then on the actual question that you asked, which was are we being enslaved by technology, is no, if there is an enslaving part or I think with terms of our agency, it is also these emergent systems that our social systems that we build. Charles Stross has a wonderful keynote at the Communication Congress, I think 3 years ago, where he makes the argument that if there's one thing enslaving us, it is the fact that we have advertising operationalized to kind of nudge us into making our consumption and political decisions according to the whims of whoever pays for them, and basically being like pushed into a form of probabilistic, like violent duress by this. You could maybe make this point, but even that would be a bit too dramatizing. It's kind of too impressive. What it really is that technology is an amplifier. Technology allows you to amplify your abilities and capabilities. And as our technology gets better, it amplifies both the good and the bad. So what we talk about with privacy, surveillance, all of the other things, these were already problems like 100 years ago. Like governments were opening letters and putting like very primitive listening devices in people's houses, like doing like the gramophone thing against the wall. And as technology gets better, these overreaches of government that needs a like political, legal solution to deal with gets more urgent. The fact that companies simply have, until GDPR, not the right, but like no reason not to collect data. It's not a technological problem. It is a pre-existing problem amplified by technology that you can't deal with more technology. You need to deal with it on the social, political, and legal level.
Okay. Are there emergent scale effects, though? Because let's trace the difference between the invasion of your privacy when someone opens your letter and what happens at the emergent macroscopic scale when it's industrialized.
That's a very big question that I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer like in one go. But like, what would you like to like specifically go into like what changes for like what do you think is like one change that you see? Because I'm having a problem to like make a big statement about this in an open way.
Well, first of all, we love big. We're called Street Talk, so we love big statements and just use your intuition. But no, I guess what I'm looking for is there's a real analogy here with the concept of scaling. We talk about the scaling of artificial intelligence. We talk about the scaling of the societal impacts. Let's use the industrialization of misinformation as an example with large language models. Is there an epistemic difference when it happens at such a broad scale across society?
I personally don't think so in the sense that like it is already a problem if you can get a small group of people into believing things that are bad for them with a lot of effort. It's just that it will only affect these people. Society at large doesn't care, basically. And it might even be useful if it is like a one-sided thing where like if you are part of like let's say you're Rupert Murdoch, you think it's lovely to be able to like spread misinformation or maybe also factual information. I don't want to get sued because Rupert Murdoch is scary, but like I'm very poor. There's nothing to gain here. But like that, like just like causing problems for the less well educated, the less privileged in a sense, and the ones who are being targeted is kind of something that doesn't affect society, so it can afford to ignore it. But now if you have, in theory, like, let's assume this is actually the case, because that's already like another one of these like implicit framings that like, yes, this technology enables this. Let's assume this allows you to like to industrialize spear phishing or misinformation, and that wasn't possible before. Then the only change that this has is now it actually becomes a problem for the people that were previously able to ignore this, and the solutions remain the same. The solutions are that you empower people to critically engage with media. I'm from Germany, so we have this Humboldtian ideal of education that you are really given the ability to engage fully as a political human actor if you are given access to the cognitive and not only cognitive, but like knowledge skill set that education gives you. And that is expensive. That used to be the privilege of a few gentlemen in their castles, like this room a bit. And now it becomes kind of, for a stable society that keeps producing like the goods that we like and keeps the economy going, it becomes kind of necessary to empower more people to do this type of critical judgment. And you can't get away with saying, it's okay, they don't need it because they will be working like menial labor jobs. We don't valorize in our society as much. That's the only change I really see in this, if we talk about. And that is like, before we get to the point that this was possible before, like we had like misinformation campaigns by like national actors, but also by just well-funded political and like religious organizations before that we had to deal with. And by definition, these were human-level intelligent because they were humans paid to do misinformation. So I don't think there's a big difference there.
Because, Igor, you said before that there's an accelerating polarization, basically. You said it was accelerating the negative and the positive. And the digital divide in general speaks to the fractionation of society and the folks who can do new types of jobs in the market, for example. So is this a significant thing to worry about?
Yeah, I do actually disagree. I think it's huge. I think the ability to predict when these potential tipping points or so happen just because you're scaling up a capability that we have had before, right? You're looking at the Second World War, the propaganda campaigns that were running there via radio. Sure, technology, but obviously not at the same scale or the same type that we are capable of now. When these arise, in what context, is very, very hard to predict. And often, you can even analyze those things only a couple of years later. When you have seen a new effect in the first place, and then you have to go through the data that you have from 3 years ago, and then have a court case about it, and so on. So our ability to really analyze this, that space of sort of epistemic coordination, epistemic warfare, hybrid warfare, that sort of information campaigns, essentially, right? One thing. There's various seminars here in Oxford that are trying to wrap their heads around how do we even talk about these new potential challenges that come with these new epistemic infrastructures that can be used harmfully. And I don't think we're fully there yet. There's a lot of terms flowing around. And again, we're having the problem of people, throwing sexy terms out and not really doing a lot of the intellectual work. So I really think we need to do a bit more work there. One of the reasons is that I think that is precisely, I wrote this one paper called Democratizing Risk, where we were sort of, myself and a co-author, Luciano, were analyzing the way that global risk studies are currently looking methodologically even at the problem of global risk. And I think they're missing a bunch of things by just pocketing things into a climate change risk or biological risk, right? Rather than looking at it from more sort of mundane literature that is looking at hazards, vulnerabilities, exposures. They're breaking it down in different ways. And one of the things that you notice quite quickly is that a bunch of types of risks sort of fall through the cracks if you just allocate them according to an expected value or these pockets of themes. And one of them are the sort of latent, potentially epistemic risks, right? So that is essentially the way that we're making decisions together, not being up to the task of the types of decisions and the type of expertise that is needed for that decision to actually come to the forefront of that decision-making moment. If we don't have that across lots of different institutions, then we're making the same replicable mistake all the time, right? And of course, these new technologies or sets of statistical tools and applications, they come into that question of how we actually are going to make decisions. And one of the super interesting areas here is we can start, both on the positive and the negative side, aggregate actual expertise for a specific task in a way that is very, very different than we've done before. At the moment, decisions are made by, people that are selected for some board, some company CEO, some people in government, selected by, procedures that at best we call democratic, which is usually every 4 years you get to, have one vote that is binary, kind of like a polling. We have much, much better tools now. The whole literature on participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, shows that actually the solution to the questions that you're raising is not to poll people in a moment where they've just formed an opinion, but to put them in a particular procedure where, whether or not you're an expert, you can deal with information that is obviously, it has to be accurate, in a way that actually processes it such that everyone changes their opinion. So these deliberative democratic methods, the literature shows, are quite good at making people change their minds and come to a conclusion which most people then end up agreeing with. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. But now you can think about circumventing a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the misinformation space by having these pockets of deliberations between citizens that are essentially protected in this particular way by having a procedure that is very trustworthy. And you can also think about scaling that with the kind of techniques that are now possible with AI tools, right? So we don't have to do it just with 100 people in a room, very expensive to organize. We see this now in Brussels, for example. They have an ongoing citizen assembly. These are great experiments, but they're obviously very local and in person. There's definitely a place for them. But obviously we can think about, what do we do with a whole platform of social media platforms that can actually be a space where people can deliberate at scale, and we can now use NLP to seep through that information, right? There's a lot of possibilities here, and one risk clearly is also not using those tools for good or misapplying them in a space where actually it shouldn't be applied yet. So the transparency of those algorithms to the citizens that are using the platform has to be, front and center with that debate.
Absolutely. And as can I just have a quick follow up with Carla, and then we'll move over. But you spoke about the themes of governance, almost a need for categorization, especially when it comes to risk. And this categorization is a little bit arbitrary because we're talking about things which are very abstract. And then you have this problem, a bit like Goodhart's law, that when you have a measure, it distorts everything because the measure bit becomes the target. And what we want in a governance strategy is to have an approach which is intelligible, not so abstract as to be ridiculous. So how do you form that categorization?
I'm a big fan of thinking about the production of risk. So when you might have heard of the term long-termism, right? Where people sort of say, oh, there's this big divide between people who think about the short-term problems of AI, fairness, bias, and the long-term problems like AGI. That's the big and sexy thing that we ought to be focusing on. If you're taking a different lens to categorizing risk, I think that categorization itself breaks down quite massively. If your interview with Sarah Hoker, for example, was a brilliant case, I think, of areas of AI safety and alignment that are labeled under the term of fairness, but absolutely are relevant to those kinds of questions that are raised by the alignment and safety community, right? Which often gets separated out as fairness is the boring bit that we ought not to focus on. But what you're noticing there is obviously that the way that the risk is being produced in the short term, so a misclassification, an unfair treatment, the problem of actually fairness being a flexible construct that we have to adapt over time, which is a political question, of course, right? How do you bake that into these algorithms? All of these questions arise in the short term. So if you're addressing them in the short term, you're also addressing the kind of risks that are being produced in the long run of the same types of technologies. So I'm generally an advocate for a sort of more empirical approach to AI risk. And then when you're thinking about, untrustworthy algorithmic applications, the way that David Dangs, for example, talks about risk and AI, which is much more focused on, we need to measure trustworthiness as a sort of final assessment of how well an algorithm is actually structured and applied, much more focused on a particular context rather than focusing on these broad categories of AI. You're focusing on a particular set of tools in a particular setting that are being applied to a particular polis, i.e. a group of people. And the solutions will differ from every scenario to the next. And I think these types of approaches where you're looking at the production of risk that is coming from the actual setting in which it is produced. So, for example, in the case here where you have particular companies that we have no decision power over when they publish something, whether they publish the source code, what kind of applications they publish in the first place, what kind of data they use for it. There's a cool paper by Leahy, I think 2019, I think something slightly fuzzy, the title is something like We Build AI or so. What they were trying to show there is that actually the algorithm or the components of the algorithm that are really weighted heavily can be constructed with the people that are going to be not applying it themselves, but are using the application. So in this case, it was an NGO, I think, that was hoping to optimize the way that they were sharing tasks or so on, right? And so it was the task of the researcher to break down the components of the algorithm that they had hypothesized might be useful to that particular task to the stakeholders. And they could essentially vote via an interface of, what do I actually value about this procedure? And do I value how quickly I get from location A to B? Or do I value that actually I do it in a particular part of the day that, I want to spend time on this or something like that? And then you end up aggregating across the people that are actually going to use the application. So what this was showing, that actually, if you do the work well, you can translate the technical knowledge into a language that is totally understandable by the average citizen, by the person who gets to use the tool. And I think that's the burden here is on the person who wants to develop that tool in the first place. And so when you're seeing citizens or users not being trustworthy of a technology, in most cases what you can track it towards is that they're not trusting the company behind it for very good reason. And in some other cases, they're very trusting of the actual technology. So when you're looking at the discussions of algorithmic applications in China, for example, which is often used as a sort of example of, terrible surveillance state, really problematic applications. And this is true. There's great reporting on this. But what is also really interesting to watch is where citizens are very happy to use that kind of technology, including facial recognition and so on. And I'm just a fan of trying to put that back into a nuanced discussion of when exactly do I care about privacy? When do I want to give it up? How do I want that data to be controlled by whom? Yeah, do I want my library to? So there's a great book it's called Burning the Books by the main librarian here from Oxford, who was making the case actually, if you have an institution behind the data collection that most people trust, the data collection itself is not the issue. It is very much, again, the political and institutional setting that makes all the difference of whether the technology ends up being positive or negative. So I really think that, a lot of the alignment or a lot of AI risk is not about specifying that one algorithm that codes ethics, which sounds to me like a very dangerous idea, but it is much more in AI governance, which is why I think it's a more exciting space to work in.
And you were speaking to an interface and a social contract, which I think is fascinating. But Igor, what's your commentary on this?
Yeah, I had wanted to just clarify that, I basically agree with you, and we don't disagree. Just what you described as this real risk, this epistemic risk, and this institutional risk, basically. It just was there before. I'm not saying it's not something to worry about. It is just something that was there already. Just until now, we were kind of getting away with ignoring it. And then the only other follow-up that I would do is that what you describe is participatory algorithmic design. That's often in this term sovereignty. That if you are involved in the design of this algorithm, you kind of sidestep the question of ethics because you really choose. Yes, we want to be subjected to this algorithm. We consent by co-designing, and we're not just products, which is kind of one of the things that you also touched on. That if you are being tracked by Meta or Google's ad serving algorithms, then you're not really consenting to that. Even with GDPR, you're not really consenting to what they're doing. It's just there's a limit for how much you can deny them. And if you put that back into the process, when by incorporating that risk production and giving you that sovereignty about, yes, this risk I want to take because I trust the actors involved, and this risk I don't want to take, you resolve a lot of the issues without any technological solution. It is really just this accessibility, asking for consent, and return of personal sovereignty in these interactions.
Tell us about your position paper.
You mean the Vox article? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, this was just the invitation to comment on the interaction between FTX and the Effective Altruism community. I guess what is interesting about it is that here's a community that prides itself to think about tail risk obsessively, right? Think about optimization obsessively and the dangers of Goodhart's law optimization and so on. And it turns out, I think they very much very much made the mistake of I guess falling prey to the dangers of optimization themselves. And the bits that actually we've already touched upon that I find most generalizable about this interaction is the epistemic risk dimension, right? The fact that you end up having a misjudgment over the trustworthiness or the accounting tools of your funder, in this case, the FTX organizations and Sam Bankman-Fried. Fine, we make mistakes, right? We have misjudgments. That is not a problem if you are in a decision-making structure or procedure, an institutional setting in which the individual mistake, I guess the error, right, of the individual encoding a problem and spitting out a solution, in this case, we go with FTX money, gets washed out in a procedure that is risk-averse and takes the minor differences between people's, diverse ways of thinking about a problem and aggregates them in a way that actually spits out the most likely risk-reducing policy, right? You're never going to, and this is a main issue again with sort of AI risk, where you're hoping to solve AI risk or alignment. That's not really a goal that we should be focusing on, because solving it to me sounds like you're trying to get something down to zero. You're trying to find the master algorithm that enshrines your version of ethics into law and into code that's very hard to change afterward. And I think that just sounds like a power grab and control. But really what we ought to be thinking about is much less about the specific outcomes that we're hoping to target and much more about a set of procedures that give you a very likely, highly probable outcome for having converged through that procedure on the policy that is risk reducing, right? And you can think about risk reduction from the perspective of the organization. So the brand of EA is obviously tarnished in some ways now that it has been associated with FTX. So that was just sort of strategically a risky move to make, to not check all the information that was available at the time that they could have looked at in order to protect their own brand against it. But there's a second dimension which I find more concerning, which is the ambition behind the EA community, or somebody called it Altruism Inc., which is just points at the incorporation of this social movement, which at the time was a social movement, then a lot of money came in, and so it changed quite a lot. But the ambition here is nothing less but to protect or do risk management for the whole of humanity and the future of all of our children and children's children. That is a massive task. Fine, okay, I appreciate the ambition. But what I don't appreciate is that you really then ought to have very good reasons that you propose you are the one to be doing risk management for everyone else, right? You have to essentially show that your epistemic procedure for converging on the risk policies are better than everyone else's, so that we can entrust you with that risk management strategy. And I don't think they've shown that at all. And yeah, this is, I guess, the main takeaway from that article, to say, really, there has to be an institutional turn at the point where you're wanting to take up that much responsibility for that many people. You have to have shown that you're incorporating all of those different ways of thinking about risk, or what risk is worth taking into account when you are doing your risk assessment, right? Because risk is so political and so values-based. It is not enough to simply say we are striving to reach humanity's potential, because the idea of humanity's potential carries a lot of subtle ideas about values and what is good in the world and what is bad in the world, right? And you cannot gloss over that.
That's so true. I mean, Igor, maybe you could quantify the damage to the effective altruism community, but also what CARLA is saying here. Some would say it reeks of paternalism, ivory towers, gatekeeping. What's your take?
As in, like, what like she is accusing EA of these things, or the issues that she's pointing out?
Well, I assume you would be skeptical of a group of people who think that they understand the trajectory to a better society better than anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, like these are like a dime a dozen, and like in my personal opinion, anybody who forecasts more than like a couple of months in advance in like a setting as large as like humanity, without like having a very precise definition of, you know, like, what do you mean with humanity? For whom are you forecasting under which? And so like is just talking out of their rear end, and I know a lot of very smart, very nice people in the EA community who are really trying and who are doing great work in very specific things. Because if you narrow it down to a much smaller scope, you can do some form of forecasting. It's not like we can't forecast anything. It's just on the scale that you're trying to do this forecasting, with all of the uncertainty involved in the evolution of it. That's like truly like hopeless undertaking. And the response to that, like if you can't forecast, if you can't do a meaningful like probability assessment about this that you can trust, is not to like try to get the probabilities better. Like there's different opinions on this, but my personal response to this is then basically to like not do any of the planning that relies on forecasting, and focus on what you can meaningfully predict, and then hope that the induction kind of carries you through. If you fix like big problems in the next 10 years and you trust the future generations that they will also be nice people who also want to like do good things for the next 10 years, like you have solved the long-term issue without needing to think about these issues. And you can't meaningfully do like, okay, like how do we act today in a way that optimizes for in 10,000 years? The only thing that you've done is you have maybe given yourself a bit of like leeway to ignore certain things in the current space, where you say, you know, my forecasting says that this thing, which is really bad for a group of people, which probably doesn't include myself, is justified because it has this really good outcome in a long time ago. Like, that's my biggest problem. And like, if you want to act in a careful way and you want to try, like, you know, like, I think William McAsler has a book like Moral Uncertainty, like truly morally uncertain, is like mainly just minimize your action to the absolute minimum. If you do act, you kind of try to get the people who you act upon on the table. This is back to the sovereignty topic. You ask them, hey, do you consent to this? And if they can't consent for whatever reason, like one of your first priorities becomes like giving the ability to consent and participating in that. Because you might still fuck it up, but at least you all fucked it up together. And this is not a diffusion of responsibility, but it is asking for consent instead of just deciding, because I'm the best one, I have the right to do this. Because this is one thing where, like, I think we agree on this, but it's like a slightly different argument. I don't care how good somebody is at forecasting. They still don't have any right to decide for me.
Well, could I touch on that in particular? So there's a spectrum, of course. On one side we have anarchism, and on the other side we have authoritarianism. And then you were speaking to something interesting at the beginning, which is, I mean, if you take the Islamic tradition, for example, it's got error correction and robustness built into it. It's designed to kind of like stay reasonably monolithic over time. And is that something to bring in there? Because you are actually on the anarchist side of things, so you don't really agree with this paternalism.
Yeah, I am always careful to like label myself as an anarchist. But what I can say, however, is that like the anarchists have the interest in critiques. The solutions are difficult to actually find and implement because they're actually not doing any of the simplifying assumptions that other kind of like ideologies tend to do, where if you're more of a like authoritarian leftist, for example, when you have this idea of you need this like vanguard party or some form of like state to kind of like create this wonderful utopia, which we know how that ends basically. And if you are of a more like anarcho-capitalist persuasion, then like you have this belief that like private property, which implies a state, and which is why most like anarchists would say that anarcho-capitalist is not a real anarchist kind of ideology. But like this will fix things. But then you kind of ignore the fact that this was the case in the 1920s, where like especially the like really careful, boring, reformist, not at all revolutionary anarchists, which are like in the tradition of like Murray Bookchin in the US, like they at least point out on the right issues, and they try to do very careful, very deliberative, very consensus-based solutions. And I think at least taking these like ideas more seriously would probably help, even just for diversity of thought, because as you were talking about like this process of filtration, I was reminded of a paper I read years ago that looked into the perception of non-diverse groups versus diverse groups, of how creative and novel they were being, and how creative and novel they actually were. And you know, as it turns out, if you're in a group of people who are exactly like you feel very at ease talking about what you think is like very bold and like edgy topics, but what actually doing is very like expected of you. Whereas if you're in a group of somebody who disagrees with you heavily, who checks you, who contradicts you, you feel like you can't be as wild and bold and innovative, because you actually have to like watch what you're saying, and nobody just hums along with your assumption. But through that challenging process, you actually make novel solutions, and so I think we should take in these in person, but we can probably also take from other like political domains, as long, this is my personal like political position, so probably there's some people who do it kind of fits a democratic and equitable mold. So any ideology that kind of has built in some idea of like, I am better than you, therefore I get some form of authority, I personally reject fully. Yeah.
Well, so Carla, just to bring you in, that's so interesting, Igor. We accept things which fall on our abstraction manifold, so things which are intelligible and familiar to us. And then it raises the question of, in a modern society, we should have a plurality of abstraction and concept and value manifolds, right?
Yeah, I have to say this term, right, democratizing or democratic, it sounds so fuzzy. It gets a bit of a bad rep. It's sort of as if there's an ideology and a political position baked into it. And yes, that can be the case. But if I'm just looking at the intersection of democracy and risk, like risk analysis to me sounds like a really technical space where you're simply trying to converge on that one policy that gives you the most likely outcome that was preferred by the people that are taking the risk together, right? And there I just think that these democratic or distributed or participatory, whatever fuzzy term you want to put onto it, take out all of the politics. It just is, to me, quite sensible to expect that this will work better, simply because we have lots of different agents that are encoding the problem differently because of the different brains and the different experiences and the different settings in which they reason. And you're throwing that together in a hopefully good aggregation procedure. And there's lots of details to be figured out. And there's, again, huge literatures there. Landmore is doing great work. Hong and Page, right? Very sort of, again, in technical settings where you can show that actually diverse groups are outperforming the expert groups that are simply less diverse, even if they're individually performing better. Dengs, Zollman, they've done similar work, right, where they can show the particular settings in which we can prove this. And then we can have a look at the empirical literature that shows actually turns out, that often produces pretty reasonable responses. That now it gets interesting. Sometimes, of course, the experts, the elites that have the PhDs and that have the nice institutions attached to their names, they might disagree with that. That might not necessarily mean that the conclusion that the more diverse group converged on is incorrect, but of course it's inconvenient. I would love to hear the argument for, you know what, let's organize how we roll out AI for the rest of humanity by essentially handing the decision to a couple of people that are sitting in a big philanthropic organization that ended up there because, I don't know, they were friends with somebody in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, this is sort of how it works at the moment, and I think the burden is really on them to make a case for that is epistemically just the best way that we're actually going to converge on a risk policy that makes any sense, right?
Yes. The problem with diversity, though, is it breeds complexity. And using intelligence tests, for example, they're designed to make the Westerners look the smartest of them all. So we get back to this problem of intelligibility, which is to say, if we have a plurality in society, I mean, maybe Igor, you can take this, but doesn't it make the governance significantly more unintelligible?
I would heavily disagree with the idea that diversity brings complexity. I think diversity like unveils complexity. So like, to be precise, like, of course, if you have a system which is perfectly homogeneous, there's like a single like type of person, like, or like everything is the same. Of course, that's like less complex. But that's not the world we live in. Like factually, like, people are quite diverse, people are quite complex, and like, not to overquote people, but like there's this thing of you should make things as simple as possible, but not more simple. So like, if you're talking about like a diverse group of people, you need to incorporate all of that complexity if you want to have a meaningful solution. Otherwise, you're just simplifying things at the cost of somebody and to benefit somebody else, which is where this democratizing comes in as well. Like, democracy does not mean vote by committee or rule by democracy means you have a say in the process. The sovereign is in a sense like the whole body. There's minority protections in there. Like, there's a whole like nuanced definition that is involved. And one thing that I think going on your like people kind of balk everything, I think one big sadness that I have is that it is being co-opted to mean you can pay for it, which we're in Oxford right now, and there's like this quirk of the British system that like the public schools are the ones that are public to everybody who can pay. I think is like the historically grown out thing, because they were the first ones to actually do that. Like, that notion of democratizing, of if you pay for it, you have access, is not what we mean when we say democratizing. What we mean is this like equitable access direction, and that will bring diversity, that will make your decision making slower, because you're actually accounting for the complexity inherent in the system. And where things are actually simple, you don't add complexity by asking a bunch of people. Like, what you do is, where you need that complexity, that plurality, you will get it, and where you don't actually need it, through the process you will converge because of the iteration for different takes on it. Like, that pluralism will, like, this is a bit of a strong statement, but I think it will just converge to a reasonable like consensus, as we see it like in academia as well, on things that are actually very uncertain and contentious. You can read it a different way. You get different lines of research, and on things where somebody figures out like the correct read on it that seems to work in all cases, people like slowly converged to that. Of course, it takes time, but we're talking about like a kind of long-term perspective, right? So like, that it takes exactly it allows you to like make mistakes. It makes sure that your mistakes kind of wash out, and it makes the whole system more resilient, which is like one thing that when you talk about like the process, like, if you have this concentrated power or like these great capabilities, designing your system to be kind of self-diffusing, self-depowering, putting checks and balances in, it's also a part of this democracy definition. That is also like built-in risk management that like even if you get somebody who is completely unsuitable for a job, or even if somebody does a horrible decision, it's not the only part of a system that was kind of keeping everything together. And that's something you get for free with all of the ethics resolving issues, with all of the kind of efficiencies you also get from people not chafing against the system and trying to defend themselves against it, because you just solve this coordination problem. But like you said, it comes with some inconvenient things, where in France they ran this experiment with citizen assemblies, and they got people from the Gilets jaunes who had previously like protested against any form of carbon taxes, and they got them in the assembly. They had like educational things to inform everybody about the issues and had debates. And then like this, I think it was like some trucker from the Bretagne who had been like on the forefront of the Gilets jaunes actually voted in favor of very drastic environmental protections that actually Macron had to scale back and kind of negotiate. Like, we would like to, but we can't. So like, can we negotiate? Which like, if you have this viewpoint that I sometimes hear in academia and when I discuss with people, that is this kind of negative view that some people just aren't able to like look over the edge of their own perspective or cross that divide, you wouldn't expect. And so this is like an empirical falsification of that belief that this type of radical democratization couldn't work. Of course, it's not a proof, but in science we don't do proof, we do falsification.
Well, could I put that to CARLA? So maybe the demos are just a bunch of plebs. I'm looking at Brexit as an illustrative and instructive example. Okay.
Yeah, I also disagree with that.
No. I mean, it was tongue in cheek, but no. I think Churchill was it who said that democracy is the least worst form of government. Mm. And cynically, I might just say that people vote in their own self-interest. So whether it's a matter of intelligibility or not, does self-interest not dominate?
Well, in many cases, I'm sure it does, and that would be a good thing, right? Because I think if you want to protect people from risk, which is the goal, right? Then you need to listen to them of what they consider to be a risk, i.e. a bad outcome that they don't want to live under. And so voting in self-interest is, under that conception, not a bad thing. But I obviously know what you mean. I'm obviously not a scholar of democracy. This is huge. So Landemore has various books, for example, where she goes through all of those objections. Some of them are more theoretical, some of them practical. What you end up seeing is that obviously there's a lot more diversity in the way that people vote. Most cases when my sense now is that when we don't quite, as you know, we don't agree with a voting outcome, or so we probably don't quite understand what the vote was really about, or so. And yeah, I think I see a lot of these examples that Igor is bringing up are exactly the ones that I'm thinking about, where actually people under a specific setting very much converge on what we consider to be useful outcomes, let's say very measurable in respect to climate politics, right? But I think it is not on the individual making a decision here. It is very much about the procedure that we put in place, right? So I think this is an argument that I'm also making in this article, which is you're not going to find a solution by trying to sort of cosplay a perfect Bayesian reasoner. It is about collective rationality, and the burden is on finding the procedures, and here AI comes in again, finding algorithmic tools, software that can allow particular procedures to manage the complexity that you rightly point out, right? Things are becoming more slow, things are becoming more bureaucratic. These tools can help us reduce all of those problems that we obviously see in aggregating across a multi-agent system when they all have different opinions and ways of proposing a solution. And that is where I think the work ought to be at the moment. And when we don't converge on something, it is probably because this procedure that aggregates information puts in the information that is actually accurate rather than inaccurate. Misinformation space, again, very interesting set of tools there, where actually the solutions are not going to be in tagging false information, correct information by some instance, right? Some board that decides what it is or what isn't. But it is much more about creating an environment in which people can reason best, right? Not having a feed that allows you to only scan the titles of the articles, but also being enabled to do a sort of crowdsourced tagging, which again uses sort of collective reasoning abilities.
Okay. And you said a kind of collective reasoning, or collective rationality was the term you used. And I mean, maybe Igor, you could comment on this, but to me, this evokes images of game theory, and Ayn Rand comes to mind, and
Jesus.
Multiple utility functions and orthogonal, moral valence usually. So, does that kind of collective rationality work for you, Igor?
So just to quickly do a thing on Brexit.
Yes.
Brexit was a non-binding referendum in a voting system where usually people do not get to have a direct say, where the parliamentary system, that is the whole justification of having indirect democracy, is that they will do the responsible thing because they're part of the elite, and if there's something stupid happening, they will say no to that. That didn't happen in this non-binding referendum. So if anything, I would personally make the argument that Brexit was an argument for direct democracies, because there are studies that in policies where they exist, so in California and in Switzerland, people actually do not vote in these kind of impulsive strategic ways to kind of just state frustration, because they actually use the fact that what they're saying matters. And it would probably be a bad idea to kind of tomorrow introduce a Swiss-style direct democracy in Britain, but it would be a completely different thing to say we commit to introducing it in 30 years. And I personally think the incentive structure for the educational system, when people who are in the decision-making positions for this realize, oh my God, in 30 years, whoever I'm educating right now gets to run the country, and not just in the elite schools, but also in the ones where they're struggling for funding for the cafeteria. That is a systemic shift in incentives that I think would come very quickly. The self-interest bit, the whole non-democratic foundation of our current society, which is the market-based vote with your wallet thing, relies on the self-interest. So we kind of as a society have on both kind of sides of a divide I don't like, with left versus right, economic versus I think these types of structure are not really helpful. But in every sane part of society that I'm aware of, self-interest is at least more or less accepted as something that isn't horrible, even in the micro level, where in a good relationship you need to draw your own boundaries. If you always hope on your partner kind of guessing your needs, it's not a good thing. So those were just direct reactions to that. Now, on your question on collective rationality and game theory, I think one thing that is missing from the modeling here often, and what I'm in a game theory lab right now, out of great luck, I have to say. But I'm not an expert in this. But through my readings, I haven't really found anything that formalizes what we're really talking about, which is negotiation and deliberation, not aggregation, because that is a different thing. It is an interactive process through, yes, there might be some form of aggregation, but you are also giving feedback, and you are expected to kind of update yourself, getting better tools to speed up this type of negotiation and deliberation and sharing of perspectives, so the whole system can converge to actually what you might formalize as a Nash equilibrium or a cause Nash equilibrium, or some form of solution concept that we consider being a good thing to converge to, and then we go with what we end up there. I think that would be a very interesting technical approach to take to improve the political and legal process. So this is where I'm a bit sad that we also have to say the alignment crowd is a very tiny subset of computer scientists, and there are computer scientists working on algorithmic mechanism design and analyses like this and building systems like this. But if you truly believe in the idea that something like a superintelligence might occur, and you have to like design like systems of incentives or find out ways to like create like the ones that are somehow in favor of all of humanity, this big mission goal, and I think this would be like one of these instances that I touched on earlier with like you want to find ways to that work across sometimes without putting a probability on them. You just find one that works in whatever world you end up in, and this would be one of them. Like using game theoretic tools and AI tools, as you also touch on, to improve this negotiation and decision-making process to get this collective rationality actually unveiled. Even in cases like Brexit, for example, where the system might not be conducive a priori, those would be interesting technical questions that go along with our perspective of that the real risks are not the technical ones.
I was just going to bring it back full circle, because this idea, which often crops up in the rationality crowd as well, right, the less wrong community and so on, that right, that the voter, the average person, is full of biases, and it's all about trying to avoid those biases. Brose and others have done fantastic work to show that a lot of the biases that we see in human psychology obviously have very good reasons for being there, because they're very adapted to particular environments, and even the current environments, they make a lot of sense, right? And you can read those papers, they're great. But when we're thinking about systems and environments that aggregate those biases together, allow them to exchange information through these deliberation tools, we can also think about the complementary capacity that AI can bring to this, right? Surely there will be spaces that no aggregation and deliberation procedure can properly cover, and that is where we can complement now with algorithmic tools that, yeah, we can call them AI or AGI. They will be generally intelligent in different ways. And I think Chris is making this argument, right, that there's no reason to replicate humans. We have a lot of humans around. Let's try and find a space where actually we are benefiting from having a different kind of bias, which we have in these algorithms, to complement the kind of space that we can't cover. And that as a whole, right, that human machine teaming assessed as a whole agent, then we can call that superintelligence. I'm happy with that. And it will include a bunch of risks that we want to deal with, but we want to deal with it as a polis, right, as a whole population of politically minded people. And that's just what I would love to see in the next couple of years.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carla. And Igor, closing statement.
So one thing that I would really like to hammer home is like my personal take on this like AI risk alignment risk thing is that the framing of this as a technical problem is extremely like overblown, and that like the really careful, really competent researchers that like I meet and I have in my lab, like the most competent in my eyes, they don't really worry about the technical side. They see technical problems to solve, and like my lab, of course I'm biased, like they have like work on robust AI, safe AI, like fairness and so on. But these are like these small incremental improvements that like we have tools to solve this. When you blow it up to a degree that is being discussed in the less wrong alignment and so on crowd, which are all like trying to do their best, and I think I'm actually like happy that they exist and they have like a different opinion than me, and they're taking this more seriously. But my critique is that they really seem to buy into the hype that this is something different. And I remember joining my lab and my PI actually kind of being a bit exasperated at my enthusiasm, oh, this is something different, and calling like deep neural networks just multi-index models. That is like a very like sober, like still like passionate take and like on working with this stuff, but it takes away this kind of anthropomorphizing magic and moves you from like this realm of like thinking about science fiction risks into actually operationalizable, precise risks. That is like something that for me is missing in that particular thing. once you then like move from these technical issues for the political side, Carla said everything, and people should like read her position paper and like just overall read what she says. That's like the final statement.
This has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to publishing it. Amazing. Yeah, thank you. Cool. Wonderful. Right, brilliant.